bills. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I give the call to the member for Corio.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise this evening to speak in opposition to the Automotive Transformation Scheme Amendment Bill of 2014. This is a bill which stands for a vast difference between the government and the opposition when it comes to the car industry. A difference which in essence speaks of the coalition being ultimately and consciously opposed to having a car industry in this country, and Labor, who have actively and willingly sought to maintain a car industry in this country from the moment that it began. In articulating the differences of approach to the car industry, I want to say that I speak very much tonight on behalf of my electorate, an electorate which has had in it Ford since 1925 making cars. The first manufacturer in our city, but a manufacturer which has been making cars in Geelong since that time. There are nearly 1,000 people today employed by Ford in relation to the car industry. Of course, there are many more who are employed in the car component industry. It is one of the most significant private sector economic pillars within the local economy. And it's not just a matter of those people who are directly employed. This goes to the health of the economy within suburbs such as Norlane and Corio, where many of those people live, the ability for people to run small businesses within those suburbs which benefit from those people who work at Ford as their customers. It goes to the question of the very identity of Geelong. You drive into Geelong and you see the big, bold Ford sign which speaks of a company which has had a long-standing engagement within our city. Indeed, perhaps a neat example of that is that since the 1920s, Ford have been sponsoring the Geelong Football Club, which to this day represents the longest sponsorship arrangement in world sport. Ours is a car town, and it is a town which is bereft by virtue of the decision that has been made by this government to intentionally seek an end to the car industry in this country. And so tonight I very much speak for those Ford workers, and I speak for the people in Geelong in opposing this bill. The practical difference that you can see between the two parties was played out in 2007, before the 2007 election. In July of 2007, we saw, under the Howard government, Ford announce that it would close its engine assembly plant intended to occur in 2010. Hundreds of people were going to lose their livelihood as a result of that decision. Of course, at the end of that year, the government changes, and by the following year, in November of 2008, with some hope, with some investment in the people of that town, with some commitment to the car industry, we see Ford reverse its decision and maintain an engine plant at the Geelong premises. That is a difference between a state of despair under the Howard government about what was seen as a hopeless future for the car industry in this country, and the sense of hope and engagement which existed under the then Rudd government, which comes from a government which is committed to the car industry and committed to the companies and the people who were within it. Hundreds of jobs were saved as a result of that, and indeed hundreds more in relation to the contractors who work in relation to Ford, and the communities, as I've described, were radically changed by virtue of the ability for Ford to continue. But I want to make the point, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, that this is not just about jobs, although it is critically about that. But it is also, at the end of the day, about the question of the capability of our country, the industry capability of our country. because we aspire to have a diverse, productive economy which climbs the technological ladder, which has within it businesses and enterprises which are high-tech and innovative. That is across the board an aspiration of government in this country. But the highest tech manufacturing that we do in this country on this day is making cars. It's why it is so profoundly important as an industry to this country. And it's also really important to understand that as an industry, it exists around the world, an industry which is in effect a public-private partnership. Governments around the world invest in having a car industry. If you look at the 13 countries which can take a car from design stage right through to completion, in every one of them there is a significant investment by the governments of those countries in keeping those industries alive and flourishing. And indeed, comparatively, the level of investment that existed in Australia in relation to the car industry was quite small, and a key part of it was indeed through the Automotive Transformation Scheme. But the reason that countries seek to invest in the car industry and have it in their countries is precisely because of the technological dividend that comes from having an industry of that kind within your country. This breeds high-skilled workers. This breeds innovative people. This breeds companies who seek to invest in research and development and improve the technological capacity of the economy as a whole. It's why it is such a fundamentally important industry for our country, and of course why Geelong was very proud to have, and still has, a significant part of that industry in our town today and over many, many decades. In keeping the industry going, Labor in government did not stop there. We invested in new high-tech industry which will have a role in the automotive sector and other parts of manufacturing. We invested $37 million in the Carbon Fibre Research Centre at Deakin University, now known as Carbon Nexus, which in turn is a much bigger facility than simply the $37 million, but it represents the high-tech manufacturing of the future. And of course, what you also saw from the then Labor government was a government which wasn't just about investing in high-tech, wasn't just about making sure that our car industry was able to keep going, but a government which was fundamentally prepared to get in there and fight for jobs when jobs were on the line. So that when we saw in 2012 Alcoa in a really difficult situation, undertaking a review of whether or not it would continue to smelt aluminium in Geelong, we saw the then Gillard government act decisively to provide the support necessary to keep Alcoa going in its darkest hour. Now, of course, in 2013, we saw Ford make the very difficult decision, the devastating decision from the point of view of Geelong, that it would no longer make cars in this country. It is important to say that no government can save every job. And it was very sad for me that in that circumstance, while Labor was in power, it was not possible to keep Ford going. But there is an enormous difference between a government which seeks to have a disposition about fighting for jobs and pursuing jobs versus a government which seeks to goad manufacturing out of the country. And that is the difference that exists today between Labor and Liberal when it comes to manufacturing in this country, and there is no better expression of it than the bill before this House today, which we are talking about right now. When Ford made the very difficult decision that they made, on the very day that they made it, the then Gillard government committed $15 million towards what is now a $30 million fund to help Geelong transition through the economic shock associated with a decision of that magnitude. As difficult as that moment was, the Gillard government stood up on the day and made sure that it was standing with Geelong to get through a very difficult moment. When we went to the election later that year, there was, in effect, a difference in the proposition that was put to the Australian people of $1 billion in support for the car industry. $1 billion difference in the proposition being put by Labor in respect of the car industry versus the Coalition in respect of the car industry. And we knew that despite the very sad decision that had been made by Ford, that proposition That proposition, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, fundamentally represented a decision or a commitment about whether or not you wanted to have a car industry in this country. That $1 billion would have seen Holden and Toyota continue its production in Australia right now, but you take that out of the system and what then transpired was absolutely inevitable. Now, at that time, in the lead up to the last election, we had the now Prime Minister, when quizzed about the question of the car industry, indeed quizzed in my hometown of Geelong, saying, and this was in a press conference in Brisbane, he said, "I want to see car making survive in this country, not just survive, but flourish." We now know that was an absolute and total lie. There is no other word for it. Absolute and total. Whether you have a car industry in this country, whether you have manufacturing in this country, is an absolute conscious decision of government, and the conscious decision of this current government has been to let manufacturing go. Now, we thought that that would play out over a matter of years. We did not expect to see it play out over a matter of months. We did not expect to see, within just a few months of this government coming to power, the Treasurer goading Holden offshore and then seeing Toyota follow suit. And of course, at the beginning of this year, in a different industry but manufacturing nonetheless, we saw the very, very difficult decision in Geelong again of our car announcing that they would no longer smelt aluminium in this country, well, in Geelong, from the 1st of August of this year. But unlike the way in which Labor responded to a decision which involved an economic shock of that magnitude to our city, what we saw from the coalition was absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. There is to this day not a single cent which has been dedicated to the City of Geelong by virtue of the decision that Alcoa made to help us through the obvious transition which has to occur by virtue of that economic shock. We are seeing a government which today has declared war on manufacturing. But not only has it done that, it has cut funds to research, it has turned it back on science, and in this bill we are seeing the government give effect to the $500 million cut which was talked about during the election. But over and above that, what we're also seeing is a decision to end the Automotive Transformation Scheme in its entirety, which involves another $400 million cut to the car industry. Now, as difficult as all the decisions that Geelong has faced in the last 18 months, one thing that has been saved is that Ford Product Development, which employs more than 400 people in Geelong, committed to continuing to be in Geelong beyond 2016. This is the part of Ford which is involved in the design and development of new cars, not just made in Australia, but indeed made by the Ford production chain around the world. A profoundly important asset in terms of the industrial capability that exists within it for our country. Like, these are highly skilled people. This is the epitome of a high-tech economy. But it is this group which benefit, or would have benefited, from the ongoing existence of the Automotive Transformation Scheme, and by virtue, through this bill, of not just giving effect to the $500 million cut that we saw at the time of the election, but actually abandoning the scheme in its entirety, we are seeing those 400 jobs be placed at risk. What we are seeing with this government, through this bill, is a government which is now seeking to complete the job that they have started in declaring war on the City of Geelong and declaring war on manufacturing in Geelong. This is a government which is seeking to dumb down the national economy. And this is a government which has absolutely cut my hometown of Geelong completely loose. Cut it completely loose in the context of what it's done with the car industry. Cut it completely loose in the context of providing nothing for the transformation as a result of the Alcoa industry, the Alcoa decision. Cut it loose in terms of the cuts that it's making to higher education, research and development. Cutting it loose in terms of what it's doing in terms of the social safety net. But what will stop this is by people in this country voting this government out of office. And I want to say to you, Madam Speaker, that as a result of this bill and everything that we have seen in this budget and everything that we've seen in relation to manufacturing, Geelong stands ready to do exactly that.
It being 7:30, I propose the question at the